you hear me okay?
Yes, I can, Your Honor.
All right. It looks like everyone's here then, and we are ready to proceed. You may ask your next question.
Thank you, Your Honor. Mr. Ford, before the break, we were looking at JX 746, and I believe you had testified that um, there were nonpartisan staff that you were familiar with from your time in the Senate. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. And is it your understanding that those nonpartisan staff work in bill drafting, legislative research, and fiscal research?
That's correct.
Okay. But the legislators and legislative leadership, they hire their own partisan staff, correct?
That's correct.
Okay.
But
And
but it's my understanding that they are hired by the legislator, but they are still nonpartisan.
okay, so is it
Meaning, it's my understanding and meaning that while a state employee should not conduct themselves in a partisan manner, which is a public employee. That's what I mean when I say nonpartisan.
okay? So is it your understanding that Mr. Woodcox was functioning in a nonpartisan role?
I'm not sure what role Mr. Woodcox was functioning in.
Okay, he's a staffer for Senator Tucker, right?
Um, if that's what it says, then yes.
Okay. And you don't know one way or the other whether Mr. Ryan was functioning in a nonpartisan role, do you?
It was my understanding that he would be functioning in a nonpartisan role.
Okay. And if we could just scroll back down to page 6 of this PDF, please. And scroll down a little bit further. Okay. So you see there, this is in the initial draft from Mr. Ryan, and he had written, importantly, at my insistence, voters can even get a free photo ID on election day. You see that?
Yes,
And that was consistent with your understanding of SB 824 that you testified about earlier, correct?
that is correct.
Okay. And now if we can scroll up to page 5 and the section I believe we were looking at right before the break. This is the email from Mr. Woodcox saying you would not be able to get a voter photo ID on election day in this bill. You would be able to get one throughout the early voting period, which is what the Ford Amendment allowed. Do you see that?
I do see that. I do not agree with it, nor did I consult with Mr. Wilcox about my understanding about the interpretation of the bill.
Okay. So if we could just scroll up to I believe it's the next page up on the PDF. This is a revised draft um, that Mr. Ryan was circulating. And my apologies, Your Honors. Let me just find the right page. And actually, if we scroll up to PDF page 3, please. So this is the revised draft, and you see here it
Wait a
now
minute. You
reads.
say revised. Can you clarify? I mean, when you say revised, what do you mean?
Sure. So if we go up to, it's a fair question. I'm happy to do that. If we go up to PDF page 2, please. You see this is an email from Mr. Ryan. It's later in the chain. Do you see that, Mr. Ford?
Yes.
Okay. And he says, all right, this version passed second reading, less wordy and changed the part about election day. What do y'all think? Do you see that?
Yes, I do.
Okay. So now if we scroll back down to page 3, And this now reads, the new law will permit anybody who does not currently have a photo identification card to obtain one for free at a Department of Motor Vehicles office or a County Board of Elections location. At my insistence, voters can get a free ID at any time during the early voting period. Do you see that?
I do see that.
And the part about election day was removed, right?
It looks like it was removed, but I want to note for the record, do you have me a part of this email chain?
I don't. I'm just asking if the draft of the op-ed that was being circulated had been revised to remove the reference to election day after Mr. Woodcox's email
And
saying
so what
that
I want to
free
note,
IDs.
And Your Honors, I would like to object. As Mr. Ford just indicated, he is not a part of this email chain, so don't think he should be commenting on what is or is not in it.
The objection's over.
And so, Mr. Ford, just to repeat my question, do you see that in this subsequent draft, the reference to free ID being available on election day was removed?
so I see that, but I am not a part of this email exchange. And so that's not at the time that I am a part of this op-ed and working with this legislation. That is not my understanding. I would further add for the record that my understanding coming from the policy staff, the nonpartisan policy staff, is that it is my understanding and that it is my understanding now that free photo ID is available on election day.
Okay, so I understand that you weren't a part of this email exchange. So why don't we take this down and let's put back up JX35, which is where your op-ed we looked at earlier. And let's scroll to page 4 of the PDF. And right at the top there, Mr. Ford, do you see that it says, my line in the sand was a change to allow voters to obtain free photo identification cards through the early voting period, and the Republican sponsors agreed? Do you see that?
I do see that, and yes,
And that doesn't say anything about the availability of free ID on election day, does it?
it does not, but that does not mean that it's not available either.
Okay. But this version of the op-ed, you would agree you did see, right? Before it was published?
I did see that version, and those are my words. Yes,
Okay.
I did sign off on that.
Okay. Now, just to go back to the origin of this op-ed, if we could pull up JX 746 again, please. And Ashley, let me know if this is possible to do, but if we could have this side by side with JX35, I'd appreciate it. Okay, and so Senator Ford, before we go through this, would you agree with me that the op-ed that was ultimately published under your name is substantially based on this draft that was done by Mr. Ryan from Senator Berger's office?
I was not a part of the original draft exchange with the other members that are on the email on my right. So I wouldn't know, but what I can say is that the op-ed that was ultimately published were my words.
Okay. Who gave you the draft that you ultimately published?
I believe Mr. Ryan worked with me on the draft, on the op-ed.
Okay. And would you agree with me, based on having received that draft from Mr. Ryan, that the op-ed that was ultimately published was substantially based on his draft?
I would say that a large part of the not having fully looked at the original draft of that exchange, I just know that what was sent over to me, that I had an opportunity to review, revise, and edit, and to put it into my own words. And so when you look at the published or the final version, that those are my words. When I make reference to whether or not my late grandmother could vote under this current legislation, and I said yes, those, sir, are my words. That is the substance of my op-ed and the substance of the photo ID that I participated in and that I helped pass.
Sure. And just to be clear for the record, Mr. Ford, I'm not disputing that you reviewed this, and I'm not disputing that you added statement about your late grandmother. I'm just simply trying to ascertain whether the op-ed was substantially based on the draft that Mr. Ryan from Senator Berger's office put together for you.
I cannot agree with that because I was not a part of, this is the first time that I'm seeing the version that you're showing me on the right. The only thing that I have to go off of is my memory of what I have seen in the exchange then at the time that I had with Mr. Pat Ryan. That's what I can go off of.
Okay. Well, why don't we take a look at the first sentence in your op-ed. Says, I'm a Democrat and I sponsored legislation with Republicans to implement photo identification in North Carolina, right?
That is true.
Okay. And if we take a look at JX 746 at PDF 2, first sentence says, I'm a Democrat and I sponsored legislation with Republicans to implement photo voter identification requirements in North Carolina, right?
That is correct.
Okay. So that part made it in. About the second paragraph in your op-ed.
I have always been my own man with my own thoughts, my own opinions.
Right.
That's true.
And if we look back at PX 746 and we look at the third paragraph, that language about you being your own man with your own thoughts and your own opinions, that came directly out of Mr. Ryan's draft, right?
That came from my words. What you don't have, sir, is my version of the exchange that I had with Mr. Ryan. What you have is just one snippet of an exchange that Mr. Ryan had with his colleagues.
Okay, and if we don't have that exchange that you had with Mr. Ryan, is that because it wasn't produced to us in this case?
I'm not sure why it wasn't produced or what happened to it, but I can just share with you that what is highlighted right now in green, that I've always been my own man with my own thoughts and my own opinions, those are my words.
Okay, you don't have that exchange anymore, do you?
No, I don't. I'm no longer a part of the General Assembly's system, and so those records were not kept.
Okay. Ashley, let's go ahead and take these down, please. Now, Mr. Ford, Governor Cooper did in fact veto SB 824, correct?
Yes, he did.
And you were the only Democratic senator who voted with the Republicans to override Governor Cooper's veto. Is that correct?
That is correct.
And by that time, as you testified earlier, you had lost your primary and considered switching parties, right?
That is correct.
And by that time, you were also endorsing Republican Senate candidates.
That is correct.
And you were also not caucusing with the Democrats at this time in the fall of 2018, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. But you believe the process around SB 824 was still bipartisan because Democrats offered amendments to the bill and some of those were accepted. Is that right?
That is correct. Democrats did offer up amendments to the bill, and the amendments were accepted and voted upon by Democrats. That is correct.
Okay. And you've previously testified that there were senators, including Senator Clark and Senator McKissick, who told you that they were happy with the bill, right?
Yes, I did.
Okay. And you've also claimed that there would have been even more bipartisan discussion about SB 824, except that Democrats decided to limit the debate, right?
That is correct.
Now, are you aware that Senator McKissick disputes those claims by you?
No, I'm not, but I respect Senator McKissick, and so that was a private conversation, and so I respect Senator McKissick's opinions on the matter.
Okay, well, opinions aside, if Senator McKissick said under oath that it was false that he told you he was happy with SB 824, do you think he was lying?
No, I do not consider Senator McKissick a liar. I consider him to be a gentleman and of high character.
Okay, and so if he said that he never told you he was happy with SB 824, then you don't have any reason to disagree with that, right?
I respect Senator McKissick's statements, and I have no reason to disagree with them at this time.
And if Senator McKissick also said under oath that Democrats did not intentionally choose to limit debate on the bill, do you have any reason to dispute that?
I do not. That was my opinion at the time, and that was my understanding at the time.
Okay, but you weren't caucusing with the Democrats at that time, right?
No, I was not caucusing with the Democrats, but I had caucused with the Democrats previously for 6 years. I'm very well aware of the tactics used in debate and in arguments with the majority, with the Republicans.
Okay, but not at the time that SB 824 was being considered. You
No,
were not
sir.
caucusing with the Democrats then.
No, sir.
Okay, so Mr. Ford, who do you think is in a better position to know the strategy of the Democratic caucus on SB 824? You or Senator McKissick?
Again, I respect Senator McKissick, and I really think highly of him.
Okay, and I appreciate all of that, but I just want to try to get an answer to my question for the record. As between you and Senator McKissick, who has a better understanding of the Democratic caucus's strategy with respect to SB 824?
My understanding of the Democratic caucus and strategy still remains the same. And again, I respect Senator McKissick's interpretation of the same process.
Okay, you're not personally aware of what was being discussed in the Democratic caucus around SB 824, correct?
I'm going to respect my colleagues' opinion and their positions on the matter, and I'm not going to dispute anything that they say.
Okay. And does that go the same for Senator Clark? If he said under oath that he thought the final version of SB 824 was inadequate in that it would create more confusion and barriers to voting than it would create election security and integrity, do you dispute that?
Object, Your Honor, a lack of foundation. There's none of this evidence is in the record.
Happy to lay a foundation, Your Honors.
Just 1 second. The objection's overruled. You may answer the question.
So Mr. Ford, I'll ask it again. If Senator Clark said in an affidavit that he believed the final version of SB 824 was inadequate in that it would create more confusion and barriers to voting than it would create election security and integrity, do you dispute that?
I respect Senator Clark as well, and I do not dispute anything that Senator Clark would say.
And does that cause you to question or doubt your prior testimony that they told you they were happy with the bill?
What I shared with in my previous testimony was a private conversation that I understood the exchange between Senator Clark and Senator McKissick. If Senator Clark had a different interpretation of that, again, I respect Senator Clark's interpretation of our private conversation.
Okay. Mr. Ford, do you know one way or the other whether African American voters disproportionately lack the forms of ID that qualify for voting under SB 824?
So this is what I know based upon research that my colleagues and I did when we originally sponsored photo ID back in 2013. And that is that we asked the North Carolina Department of Motor Vehicles to give us a list of a total number of registered driver's license issued versus the number of citizens in the state of North Carolina. And it was a very, very small number. Demographically, racially, I'm not sure exactly what that breakdown was, but there were more state issued driver's license than there were folks who were listed as citizens in the state of North Carolina.
Okay, and my question was just specifically as to the forms of ID that are acceptable for voting under SB 824. Do you have any information on whether African American voters in North Carolina disproportionately lack those forms of ID compared to white voters?
I am not aware of that. No, I am not.
Okay, and the General Assembly, to your knowledge, did not evaluate data on that question before it passed SB 824, correct?
The data that I have, which was given to me by the North Carolina Department of Transportation through the DMV office, gave us a glimpse at the number of issued driver's license to the number of citizens in the state of North Carolina. That's
Okay,
the data that I recall, and that's the data that I have.
and that was in 2013, correct?
That's correct.
Okay, so in 2018, when the General Assembly was considering SB 824, you're not aware of any data on the racial demographics of ID possession that was evaluated by the Assembly, correct?
No, I'm not.
Okay. And as one of SB 824's primary sponsors, you could have asked for information on that if you wanted to, right?
That's correct.
But you did not.
I have the data that I had from the Department of Transportation, and I was comfortable with that data,
The data from 2013.
the data from 2013.
Okay. Now, I believe you testified earlier, but I just want to be sure that it's clear for the record. At the time that you were sponsoring SB 824, you didn't believe that in-person voter impersonation was an issue in North Carolina. Is that correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Is that still your view?
That is correct.
Okay. Now, since leaving office and submitting your affidavit in this case, in addition to being nominated to the Board of Governors, have you also endorsed at least one Republican Senate candidate?
I believe at least two since then.
Okay. Was Senator Kravick one of them?
That is correct.
And Senator Kravick was one of the other primary sponsors of SB 824, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. Now, Mr. Ford, I should have asked you this earlier, but since your deposition, have you had any conversations with Senator Berger or his office about being appointed to the Board of Governors?
Since being nominated and appointed, no.
How about before you were nominated?
I believe, yes, I do recall having conversations with Senator Berger, and I think it had to center around, well, no, it was his staff, centered around my willingness to participate or be a member of the Charter Advisory School Board.
Okay. And just so that I'm sure and so that the record's clear, did that also relate to you wanting to serve on the Board of Governors?
No, it had my willingness to want to serve the state.
Okay, so just to be sure I got an answer to my question, between June 20th, 2019, when you were deposed, and the time that you were nominated to the Board of Governors, did you have any other conversations with Senator Berger or his staff about your desire to serve on the Board of Governors?
Oh, no, no, absolutely not. No,
Okay, so it was just the one conversation before you signed and submitted your affidavit in this case?
that's correct.
Okay. Mr. Ford, thank you for your time today. I have no further questions for you at this time, and I'll tender the witness.
All right. Mr. Patterson, you may cross-examine the witness.
Okay, thank you, Your Honor. This is Pete Patterson for the legislative defendants. Good to see you, Mr. Ford. I'd like to just start with some background information, although you've been testifying for a while today. Tell us where you grew up.
I grew up in Belmont, North Carolina, which is in Gaston County, to a single mother in public housing.
And where did you attend college?
North Carolina Agricultural and Technical State University.
And where did you begin your professional career?
I began my professional career in Atlanta working in the environmental business.
Okay, and what other sorts of ventures have you been a part of in your professional life?
I've had entrepreneurial ventures in waste management, barbershops and salons, restaurants, and even had some time in the construction arena working with trucking. And now I am in the risk management business as a licensed insurance agent.
Okay, and at one time, did you hold a position with the Charlotte Housing Authority?
I was chair of the Charlotte Housing Authority.
And when were you chair of the Charlotte Housing Authority?
Oh my goodness. It was before I went to the legislature, so 2008 to 2011.
And can you describe some of the initiatives that you championed while you were in that position?
Was very, very proud to work on homeless initiatives in the city of Charlotte. Also worked on collaborations with a number of nonprofit organizations to provide more affordable housing in the city of Charlotte. One of the other initiatives is working on the now renovated Boulevard Homes in the city of Charlotte, which is now Renaissance West. Boulevard Homes was one of the more rougher, tougher parts of our community where there's a tremendous amount of crime, high unemployment, and a number of issues that disproportionately affected African Americans in the city of Charlotte. Was able to work with the staff and the federal government to revitalize Boulevard Homes into Renaissance West, which currently now has an early childhood development center, a senior housing facility, workforce, new high quality, safe workforce housing, along with a neighborhood public school that was new to that development as well.
Okay, very good. And do you recall testifying, I'm sure you do, about your recent appointment to the North Carolina Board of Governors?
Yes, I do.
If we could pull up LX 249, this is Senate Resolution 258. Okay, and if we could scroll down, do you see at the top that says a Senate resolution electing Joel D. Ford to the Board of Governors of the University of North Carolina?
Yes, sir.
And do you understand this to be the Senate resolution that affected your election to the Board of Governors?
Yes.
And that was Senate Resolution 258. Is that correct?
Yeah, yes.
Okay. And Your Honors, I would like to move this into evidence just based on the amount of testimony that's been about this resolution today, if we could.
Well, it's not the defendant's turn to introduce evidence, but with the consent of the plaintiff and the other defendant, I will consider admitting an exhibit from the defendant at this point.
Your Honor, plaintiff's preference would be to wait for these to be admitted during the defendant's case in chief, and we can deal with any potential objections at that time.
Sounds like that's an objection, Mr. Patterson, to your introduction of evidence during the plaintiff's case in chief. That objection seems to be in order, and so your move to admit this exhibit at this time is denied.
Okay, thank you, Your Honor. We'll bring up LX 250 now. And this is the roll call vote on Senate Resolution 258. Senator Ford, this is, as we said, the roll call vote for the Senate Resolution 258, which, as we just discussed, was the resolution putting you on the Board of Governors. Do you see on this document what the final vote on that resolution was?
45-3.
Okay, thank you. We can take this one down. I would like to bring up LX 248 now. And this is the transcript of the consideration of Senate Resolution 258. Okay, and I would like to go down to page 3 and focus on a statement by Senator Muhammad. Do you see there at line 3 where it says Senator Muhammad is starting to speak?
Your Honors, object to this being read into the transcript at this time. It appears to be an out-of-court statement from someone who's not a witness in this case.
I'm going to overrule the objection at this point.
Okay, thank you, Your Honors. I'd like to go down to line 10, and I would like to read some of this and then ask you some questions about it. So at line 10, we start where Senator Muhammad is speaking. He says, I also know that diversity is our strength. I believe that to my core. I believed it when I applied to UNC Charlotte. I believed that when I enrolled at North Carolina Central University School of Law. And I still believe that now as I serve with each of you in the North Carolina Senate. Then he continues, that is why I believe we need a leader at the UNC Board of Governors. And if we could scroll down here so we can see the rest of the statement. And if there's one thing I know about Joel Ford, it's that he loves UNC Charlotte. He loves our historically Black colleges and universities, and most importantly, the North Carolina A&T Aggie Pride. Now, I'd like to stop there for a moment. Is North Carolina A&T the university which you attended, a historically Black college or university?
That is correct.
And is Mr. Muhammad correct that you love our historically Black colleges and universities?
That is correct.
And as far as you know, when was the last time a graduate of North Carolina A&T served on the Board of Governors?
The late Franklin McCain, back in the early 90s.
Okay, great. And then I would like to pick up reading where I stopped at line 17. Mr. Muhammad continues, that is why I believe we need a leader at the UNC Board of Governors. And if there's one thing that I know about Joel Ford, it's, oh, I'm sorry, I already read that. I'll start at line 24. When I walk onto the campus of UNC Charlotte, I see students that look like me, Joel Ford even, and even like my friend Mike Woodard, young scholars. I don't know about how young, Mike, but young scholars applying to bodies of higher education, building and growing together to create a North Carolina that we can all be proud of, supporting each other and growing together. That's why I rise today in support of the Honorable Joel Ford's appointment to the UNC Board of Governors. I'd like to let's scroll down. Now, I know that many of you know that Joel and I have had our differences, and we may not agree on everything. but as a former senator that represented UNC Charlotte, we love our 49ers, and as a fellow HBCU grad, we love our HBCUs. It's because of that love and advocacy and diversity of that representation and experience that I know Joel Ford will bring. That's why I ask for his support, and I ask you in joining and allowing Senator Ford to serve our community to the best of his capacity and being a champion for our UNC system, our HBCUs, and UNC Charlotte. Mr. Muhammad mentioned that you and he had your differences. Which Senate district does Mr. Muhammad represent?
Senate District 38.
And how did he come to represent that district?
He defeated me in a primary.
And was your support for HSB 824 in any way dependent upon you receiving an appointment to the North Carolina Board of Governors?
Absolutely not.
And is your testimony in this case in any way related to or dependent upon you getting appointment to the UNC Board of Governors?
Absolutely not.
And what is your role for the North Carolina Board of Governors?
I am now elected to the Board of Governors as one of 24 members whose responsibility, one is fiduciary, two, helping set policy for the entire system, which includes our 16 colleges and universities, as well as the Governor's High School.
And what are your priorities that you're hoping to accomplish in the North Carolina Board of Governors?
One, making our colleges and universities more affordable. Two, making sure that they remain relevant in producing graduates that will be either career ready or ready for their continued graduate studies. Three, creating transparency and accountability as to how public funds are expended throughout our university system.
And you testified on direct that when you were in the Senate, you were a member of the Democratic Party, correct?
That is correct.
And you remain a member of the Democratic Party today, is that right?
That is correct.
And did you ever leave the Democratic Party?
I have not.
And have you held leadership positions within the Democratic Party?
I have held leadership positions within the Democratic Party prior to being elected to the North Carolina Senate. I was chair of the Mecklenburg County Democratic Party from 2008 to 2011.
And I believe on direct, you testified about the importance to you of supporting good policy. And we're here today talking about SB 824, but other than SB 824, what are some other policies that you supported in your time as a senator?
House Bill 972, which was a Republican-sponsored bill that created police transparency and accountability that would, through a process, release police body camera and dash camera video. I also supported the Republican-sponsored legislation for NC Promise, which created college affordability for HBCUs as well as for UNC Pembroke. That particular piece of legislation has helped almost single-handedly revitalize Elizabeth City State University by making tuition more affordable. I supported a number of other initiatives in terms of providing for teacher raises. One of the other pieces of legislation that I supported was raise the age. North Carolina was the last state in the country to charge juveniles with as adults. I was able to support that Republican sponsored piece of legislation that would no longer charge juveniles with nonviolent offenders as adults.
And other than SB 824, are there other election-related bills that you supported during your time in the Senate?
The photo ID bill that I was able to sponsor in 2013.
And what issue were you trying to address with the 2013 voter ID bill that you sponsored?
My colleagues and I on the Democratic side recognize that voter photo ID was a unnecessary political wedge, and that if we could come up with a piece of legislation that was bipartisan, that we could figure out a way how to take this issue off of the political table, secure our elections, and to ensure that every registered voter in the state of North Carolina would be able to vote if you, whether you had an ID or not. And if you didn't have one, one would be provided for you for free.
And Senator Clark, how would you describe your political philosophy?
You said
Senator Ford. Senator Ford. I'm sorry. I was thinking Senator Clark, since you had just testified about your bill with him. Senator Ford, how would you describe your political philosophy?
I would describe my political philosophy as being center right. I am more moderate on the social issues, but more conservative on the physical issues.
And you testified that you voted against the constitutional or the legislation to put the constitutional voter ID amendment on the ballot. Why did you vote against that if you supported voter ID as a policy?
I didn't believe that we needed a constitutional amendment, but I was still able to support legislation that is, or that was common sense, that was reasonable, that provided for a safe, secure election process.
Okay, I'd like to bring up JX 410, and this is House Bill 1092, the bill that put the constitutional amendment on the ballot. If we look at section 1, it says photo identification for voting in person. Voters offering to vote in person shall present photographic identification before voting. The General Assembly shall enact general laws governing the requirements of such photographic identification, which may include exceptions. Now, it's your understanding that this amendment passed in the November 2018 election, correct?
Overwhelmingly, yes.
And after the constitutional amendment passed, to what extent did you understand the General Assembly to have the option to simply not enact a voter ID law?
Being a member of the minority party, we simply do not have any access, influence, or control over the legislation that is introduced or when the legislation is introduced. And so I had no conversations previously after the amendment, the Constitution, voter photo ID Constitution Amendment was passed.
And after this amendment was passed, could the General Assembly had just elected never to enact a voter ID law?
That was at the discretion of the leadership.
And is it your interpretation of this amendment that the General Assembly is required to enact implementing legislation?
Yes, it is their requirement, especially once the voters will to have a constitutional amendment.
And as a senator, had you sworn an oath to support and maintain the North Carolina Constitution?
I did swear an oath. Excuse me, I did swear an oath. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator. And as a senator from a district that voted against the voter ID amendment overall, what were your options in considering how to approach potential implementing legislation?
Can you restate the question, please?
Yes. I believe on direct, you testified that, like yourself, a majority of the voters in your district did not support the voter ID amendment. But once it passed, what were your options as a legislator in how to approach implementing legislation?
My options as a legislator was to do one of two things, either to do my job as a legislator or to not do my job as a legislator. I had two options, and I chose to do my job.
Let me stop you right there if you can. It's now 4:30. For reasons that I really don't need to go into on the record, we're going to go ahead and stop for the day at this point. Are there any really quick matters that we need to take up prior to recessing court for the day?
Your Honor, this is Paul Brockman for the plaintiffs. There are some exhibits from Mr. Ford's examination that we would like to formally move in during the housekeeping time, but not sure if you want to recess before that.
We're going to do that tomorrow morning at 9:30. We'll allow for the introduction of exhibits and the finish. Mr. Ford, are you available tomorrow morning at 9:30?
I had, Your Honor, I had been scheduled to travel to Chapel Hill to conduct the business of the Board of Governors on tomorrow morning, and that is right in that window. I can,
That's okay.
figure out.
You can come back later. I don't want you to miss that. We can pick right up when you are available. We can pick right back up with the continuation of Mr. Patterson's cross-examination of you when you're able to come back, and I'll just let you work that out with the lawyers in the case. Okay.
Your Honor, I really appreciate your accommodations. That is very, very helpful. Thank you, sir.
You're very welcome. We'll see you back later on in the trial. Ms. Riggs, do you have another witness that you can call tomorrow morning?
Yes, Your Honor, we do, and we would just remind the parties that the rule of witness sequestration is still invoked as it relates to Mr. Ford.
Okay. Thank you all very much. We're going to go